you think of three words: you're measuring value, creating value, realizing value. So owners need to get a handle on how to measure value. Otherwise, you're playing soccer and there's no nets. You show up, you're kicking the ball around.
Welcome to Barenaked Money, the podcast where we strip down the complex world of finance to its bare essentials. With your hosts, Josh Shellick and Colin White, portfolio managers with Verecan Capital Management, Inc.
Welcome to the next edition of Barenaked Money. Colin here with a very special guest, Rakesh Jain. Did I pronounce your name properly, Rakesh?
Correct. You did.
There we go. So Rakesh and I'm not going to give away timelines or anything, but we did know each other back in the day as he is an old accounting prof of mine. I'm not going to give any more hints as to how long ago that was, but Rakesh is a CPA working with Baker Tilly in Halifax, Dartmouth. And he's been in corporate finance for over 40 years. And we're going to have a chat today about employee/management ownership or takeover of a business as a form of a succession plan. So Rakesh, welcome.
Thank you very much, Colin.
So let's dive into it. We have conversations with lots of business owners. And for those who are looking to move on to their just rewards on the other side of retirement or financial independence, one of their options is to do an internal transfer of power, if you will, to either the employees or the senior management group. So is that a very common and very successful or good way to do it?
I think one thing about Atlantic Canada is that owners are really concerned about their employees, and it's a little different than other parts of Canada because you've got evidences of Icelandic companies coming in to buy various quotas from large fishing companies here in Nova Scotia. And the concern that the owners had was they would just shut down the plants, put 200 or 300 people out of work. And those deals were very lucrative deals, but the owners said no. And those plants exist today in Nova Scotia hands. Mersey Seafoods, Camo Seafoods are two examples. So I think we can extrapolate that. In my experience, owners are quite concerned. I hesitate to use the word family. I try to get owners to say it's not family, they're a team, because, but they really tend to use that word interchangeably. And I think the big issue is there are always 1, 2, 3 employees that have been around at least 10 years or more. They've earned the right to actually run the business. And yet the owner has a dilemma where these individuals are competent but don't have any cash or access to cash. And therefore, the owner who has a shorter timeline can't really take a vendor note for the entire amount. He needs some cash. And so what happens, we see some of these management folks leave and start a competitive company, or they'll stay with their arms folded and not very happy. And the new owners will find it very difficult to transition the culture because the new owner will not have the same chemistry that the former owner did. So there's a world of issues that come up. So I see that there's a need. The question becomes, how do you make it happen?
Well, it's interesting because you talk about using the word family and team interchangeably, and those are radically different things because I have a family and a coached team. Those are two different forms of relationships. One is more fraught than the other. I think I've always found it healthier to refer to a business as a team because, again, you want to make sure you're working with a group of people that are aligned, and that's more rewarding and beneficial to everybody involved rather than having your idiot Uncle John sitting at the table for no apparent reason, right? But wouldn't you agree that I think part of the issue is how long some of these owners wait before they begin the transition? You know, is this a problem of their own creation? I mean, I've seen lots of founder owners who've gotten into the situation where they're in their 70s thinking about maybe I should start transitioning my business now. And then it becomes an awfully big nut to crack rather than if they consider doing it earlier. Is that something you've seen as well?
Yeah, it's a issue about letting go. and a lot of them don't let go. Their relevance, their purpose is all built into that business. But the value of a business is really the ability for that owner to make themselves dispensable. And every day, that's the thought. Work on strategic issues, don't micromanage the employees, uh, try to make yourself dispensable. And a lot of owners don't start that transition early because they don't understand the value of their business. They hear their anecdotal evidence. Well, I heard that John sold his business for 5 times a number. Well, that's not the way valuations work. And uh, this business might only have one customer. So the valuation is going to be lower. This business might have one supplier, or it may have a lot of competitors. There's no cookie cutter. So an owner who thinks that on Monday he wants out can't start on Friday.
Yeah.
Sometimes it's even tax related, Colin, where there was a company that I think there were 8 children, and they had another accounting firm. They came in and they said, I can get 13 million for my business. I'd like to spread it out amongst but they didn't have a family trust. And so that entire 13 million went into the one owner's hands. And there's no way to do that except waiting a couple of years, and time kills deals. So good luck getting that same offer 2 years from now.
Well, I think it's one of those things that, it's amazing when when you watch a founder-led business or somebody that's been a business owner and they build something. I mean, that is very, very uncommon. It's very difficult. Many more businesses fail than succeed, so you need a very specific skill set, a dogmatic, approach to things. And I always describe it as a gag reflex. Like, no matter what happens, you can get past it, and then it becomes your identity. And in that process, you become a little necessarily tunnel vision towards that skill set. And it's very uncommon to be very successful in any particular arena and still maintain the perspective to truly understand the value of an enterprise. And, that's a leap for somebody who's been largely so hands-on through the whole journey and made all the primary decisions, and to kind of give up some of that control. And identity, as you said, is a bit of a difficult process. I had a conversation with a guy. We've been talking for a number of years, and he was always talking about, succession plan, building a team, and he's trying to attract talent, because this is also another one of the caveats. If you want to attract talent, you need to give them a reason to be there, and that can often take form as a percentage of our ownership. And we've been talking for 5 or 6 years. We sat down just for a conversation, and he was still talking about it. I said, well, how much of the business do you own? He goes, oh, I still own 100%. You're 68 years old. If you don't go walk back to the office and give away 10% of your business, you're not even serious. And to his credit, he did. He walked back to the office, called the lawyer right away, and said, we need to do paperwork because I've got 2 senior people here. And I got to stop thinking about how to do this, and I just have to get it done. Because, senior people, qualified people who are going to have the skill set to carry on, they're going to get other offers. They're ambitious people. You want the ambitious people who are willing to take initiative to stay around. And, sometimes it just gets started, get them an ownership stake, however that happens, and then work on the details, as you move forward. Again, it's just getting them to take that action, but it involves giving up some of that sense of accomplishment. And frankly, sometimes it's greed. Like, I want all this for myself, or all this for my family.
No, I think that's well put, Colin. For lack of a better word, we call those golden handcuffs.
Yeah.
And it really builds that stickiness, and it creates a lot of stability in an organization when there is a succession plan, and that's been communicated to the staff, how it all works, and there's a line of sight. But hope, as they say, it's an overworked quote, can't be your strategy. And unfortunately, I'm at that age where a lot of colleagues and friends are coming up with unexpected health issues. And so why not take control of the succession process rather than having some event take control of you?
But it's funny you bring up the golden handcuffs, because I've always bristled at that. I've never wanted to handcuff anybody to me.
Yeah.
I've wanted to entice them. Like,
Yeah.
if you don't want to be here, I want the door wide open, because I have seen people who have levered themselves in a position where they have people tied to something. And I love your expression. They folded their arms. When you see somebody fold their arms, that now you have a bigger issue.
Mm.
So, but I mean, I understand the sentiment for sure. But I think you can frame that in a more a positive light on things. It's like you want to entice people to stay. You want them to be rewarded for staying. You want them to have a path forward. And you end up with, in my opinion, maybe a smaller piece of a much bigger pie. Because hanging onto it too tight means that it's going to run between your fingers at some point.
There's a tremendous advantage when a management buyout is in place because there's an element of trust that the owner has in the individual. The only issue the owner has is they would like to see a significant portion of that purchase price paid at closing.
Yeah.
And so I've built models because this is something that I'm going to explore further in my next career, which is actually facilitate management buyouts. And I think that the amount of due diligence is really low because the managers know what they're buying. Sometimes they know more than the owner because the owner's done such a good job of making themselves dispensable. The other thing is culture. You know, Colin, I know you and I have talked about this recently, and culture is everything.
Yeah.
You can put core values on a wall, but those core values have to drive behaviors every day.
Yeah.
And when I had my own firm before I sold it to Baker Tilly 8 years ago, my team knew what they couldn't do, where the fences and boundaries were based on those core values. But anything within that boundary, whatever they needed to do to get the job done, was fine
Yeah.
because I was more interested in results
Yeah.
and making sure that our client base was extremely, extremely happy.
Well, it's interesting you bring up the due deal side of things because you're right. That's a huge deal in a business transaction is the diligence stage and using internal people who probably know where a lot of the bodies are buried is probably one way to shortcut that. But in my experience, but what you add is the expectations of the owner, because the owner is expecting them to do it exactly as he would have done it or she would have done it. And that whole art of giving up the control of the business and sitting back and watch somebody else run your baby without interfering with it. And that's got to be a studied thing. Like that's got to be a very and it's got to be an open conversation between the departing and incoming ownership groups, because otherwise, again, it's that whole gag reflex of somebody who's built something and thinks they know best and may disagree with some of the decisions getting made. We're not spending time in due diligence, but maybe spending more time on managing that relationship with the departing owner. Do you have any ideas or any tips for people on how to, other than communication? Like, is that something that goes in an agreement or?
I've been in situations where the owner has given the general manager a chance to buy the business. And the general manager has basically gone to every investor he knows. And in a small town, that wasn't the way it was supposed to happen. And I said to the owner, you can't have this person knocking on doors looking for equity to help him buy the business. You have to be involved. So the amount of and confidentiality is so critical in terms of making these kind of transactions happen. But the deal structure is very flexible. You can be. I'm not sure if I'm answering your question, Colin, because in evaluation, the premise is that you get all your cash at closing. But when you're dealing with a general manager, that goes out the window because that becomes the floor for what the price should be. Because if the owner is expected to take back some money, then the price can be higher and the terms can be very flexible. And the fundamental premise is trust, that the owner feels quite content that he was able to receive 70 to 80% of the purchase price, and the rest he's able to hold and put some checks and balances in terms of control. And I can tell you that the general manager works very hard to get rid of those checks and balances and have the owner out of the business so that he can make
Yeah.
it his business truly.
Yeah. Well, that's the answer I was looking for. So it's about putting the checks and balances in place so that there's a clear path to the departure. Because you're right. If the departing owner is going to take back a note for part of the purchase price, they still have a dog in the fight. So they're going to be more likely to want to participate and avoid perceived mistakes, and therefore maybe even cause more conflict with the general manager that's taking over. So having those checks and balances, I guess that's healthy. That's healthy motivation for the incoming group or person to, get everything all cleaned up so that the departing owner can depart and go off onto their next adventure, whatever it is.
It's worth a it's worth a shot to try the management buyout first before you go, because at least you've given your team a chance to buy it. And then a third party coming in may want to create some sort of a ladder where those key employees can actually be rewarded through some sort of a phantom stock option plan or a real stock option plan, but some sort of a performance mechanism. The only two disadvantages, or there's a few, but really the disadvantages of a management buyout sometimes is that a strong technician doesn't make a strong entrepreneur. So you could be the best electrician in the world, but putting your belt down and starting to run a company, it's so the owner's got to really understand all of the strengths and weaknesses of this general manager. They have that ability. I like to say that a management buyout, management has to have some skin in the game. It could be as little as $50,000. I've helped managers buy companies with $100,000 that are 3 or 4 or 5 million. And the magic is making sure the cash flow covers the debt that's taken on. So we want that manager not to lose their home, but they don't get really great sleep. And and that's sort of the balance you strike when you have skin in the game.
Well, the challenge is that, a lot of founders who created something, there was basically a void in front of them. Like the next step hadn't been taken, and they were the ones that obviously had to take that next step and grow into it and figure it out. And the arc of many founder-led businesses is a whole bunch of those moments where they're stepping into a void where nobody else was there to take the responsibility. Nobody there had the skill set, so they had to figure it out. And by stepping aside and creating another void, then you're leaving that room for the general manager behind you to step into the void. And then everybody watches. Like, can they stick the landing? Like, do they have what it takes to get to that next step? And you can take a lot of courses and you can spend a lot of time figuring it out. But until you're sitting there with, under live fire and, tariffs just got announced and you got to figure out how to bounce. Until that moment, nobody's sure. And, that's where the excitement comes. That's where the reward comes. But it's challenging for one generation who always filled that void to sit back and leave room for somebody else to fill the void.
And this is why time is needed to have that plan so that you can say, okay, this is what I'm thinking. Let's watch this general manager, give them more duties and responsibilities. Let's see if they can handle that, because I'm still owner of the company. And let's let them take over some meetings. And maybe even I'm going to take a 2-month vacation and see what happens.
Yeah. Well, just not out of the blue. I mean, have a plan to get to that moment.
Yeah.
But yeah,
Yeah.
the other thing I challenge Steve is leading a business can be very lonely.
Yeah.
And what I always challenge business owners is to make sure you maintain your peer group and watch what your peers are doing in this regard. Take a look at what's worked and what hasn't, and try to inform yourself and take that next step deliberately. Like, have an idea, do some FAFO, like do some A/B testing, and do it very methodically so that you build a skill set around you and you begin to build that up. But let's get practical for a second, because you're talking about sources of financing stuff, and I'm aware of some of the cash flow lenders that are out there, but they all have nuances as to the kinds of industries they want to be involved in and stuff. Could you maybe run down the playing field a little bit for a GM as to the different sources of capital that they could pursue?
Well, let's look at a business. Maybe it's representative, but the logic applies to most businesses. So let's say the business is doing $3 million in sales, and has $300,000 in income before income taxes. You can add back depreciation and interest costs, and that becomes, let's say, 500,000 of what we refer to as the EBITDA. And that EBITDA can service debt. So at, let's say, 7%, you could probably borrow a couple of $1 million, to find. And a lot of banks, Roynet, BDC, and most of the chartered banks are looking more at cash flow and how is this person going to service the debt. So they look for a ratio of around 1.3 times. So it's entirely possible. And I've been very successful in, especially if the cash flow can be, if it can be demonstrated that that cash flow is solid and that there's a growth strategy. And that growth strategy is really critical. And that growth strategy is something that the owners may not be interested in, but the new general manager might want to do an acquisition or buy a piece of equipment or buy an extra building, or they get excited about that growth plan.
Yeah.
And so I want to see that excitement in that general manager, what they would do. And that excitement transfers into the financing package. And I see virtually all the chartered banks, they used to not be in that game, but they are actually cutting the grass of companies like BDC and Roynet, who were cash flow lenders. So there is no shortage of access of funds. Like most banks will finance cash flow. And then, of course, they'll take security, but their main interest is this manager solid? Is this business solid? And is there a growth plan? And you're most of the way there.
Well, again, you struck on something that's pretty systemic. As somebody who grows a business and gets to a certain point, the growth mindset kind of goes away. You get into, coast mode or semi-retirement mode or slowdown mode, or the fire dies a little bit and you're not as aggressive as you were when you were building the business. And it's almost a changing of gears, so the next generation may still have that fire, and they should have that fire because they're going to be taking on a new challenge. So the business will necessarily kind of change its demeanor. And it's interesting to see how important that could be and reflected in the financing that's available, having that vision and that plan that you can put on paper to say, okay, over the next 5 years, here are the steps that we want to take, and here's what and from a seasoned operator, somebody who actually understands and knows the business.
I run across, I'll ask questions like, my standard question is, what keeps you up at night, to most owners?
Yeah.
That helps me understand where their threats and weaknesses are in the SWOT analysis. Everyone, they understand their strengths and opportunities, but they tend to sometimes ignore their weaknesses and threats.
Yeah.
So what keeps you up at night? And that's an important question. The second question is, if you're doing 5 million in sales or you're doing 10 million, what's your plan? What would you do to make it 10 million? And they get stumped at that because that's not in their wheelhouse. They're working day to day. They show up Monday through Friday, and they're not even really conscious of threats and opportunities that could be regulatory. It could be a workplace injury. It could be anything. They're not managing risk. They have kind of strategy that's intuitive, but they're not formally assessing where are the risks, where am I going to get blindsided.
Yeah.
And so the best way to deal with this is, look, I'm not going to coast. If I'm coasting that old line, I'm falling behind. So how am I going to grow this to 10 million or double the sales if your business is currently doing 5? And I've been pretty successful in convincing a buyer that that's a legitimate trajectory, that this is pretty solid. They would buy a piece of gear. No one's doing that right now. That piece of gear would give them 2 million. They would now take on another service line that would give them 1 million. And why? So there's concrete steps. And then you can build timelines and milestones so that if in the first 3 months you haven't hit those milestones, time to revisit that plan and look at and pivot and see how you get back to that 10 million goal another way. But
Yeah.
I see this is very rare. And if you want a really good multiple and value for your business, then you have to have that either in writing. My preference is writing, just like the way you operate with investment policy statements and so on. You have that understanding with your clients that this is their expectations. So very few owners have really given that a lot of thought, Colin.
Yeah. Well, I think it's interesting that I've watched different business owners not know what they're selling. Like it really depends on what you have, and therefore, is it a going concern that you're selling? Is it something that one of your competitors would like to buy? Are you selling intellectual property? Are you selling eyeballs? And then if your motivation, and again, it depends on the individual owner. Are you doubling down on I want to look after my community? I want to look after the people who work here. I want to look after my clients. I want to maximize my economic outcome here. I want to take all my risk off the table. I want to stay involved after I'm gone. All of those are pivotal questions that can take the conversation in a dramatically different direction. And I've met very few business owners who understand that whole playing field. Like that's where the advice from people like yourself who have been in a few dozen, couple hundred deals over the years to say, hey, listen, I recognize this pattern. Last time I saw this pattern, here were two things that, really helped. And again, it's not necessarily that, you're being paid for your time. You're being paid for what you know. And being in the room, you can dramatically change because there's some really fundamental questions that people don't even know to consider. I had one conversation with a guy one time, and he was trying to value his trucking business. And this guy started with a truck, and he now had a fleet of trucks. And I started talking about his valuation, and he said, okay. And I thought we were just starting a conversation. He came back like 3 months later with a Kinko's box full of colored printouts of every piece of equipment he owned with a full appraisal done. I did the valuation. He passed me. He's like, that's not a valuation. Like, but in his mind, the only value in his business was the net value of his equipment. He couldn't conceive of anything else, right? And that's perfectly fine because he's a very successful business guy. He made really good money and he provided good incomes for a lot of people, but he just didn't have that skill set to kind of keep it going and get it to that next level for whatever he deemed important. Like whether it was keeping those people working or whether it was in those communities or whatever his values were, because those all call for a different approach.
I think that's a really valid comment, Colin. We're talking about dollars, but it's more than dollars. It's qualitative as well as quantitative. And you think of three words: you're measuring value, creating value, realizing value. So owners need to get a handle on how to measure value. Otherwise, like you're playing soccer and there's no nets. You show up, you're kicking the ball around. Like let's
That's a great visual. That's a great visual. All right, I want to show up. I want to put a net here. Wow, look, there's a net.
But everything is purpose-based, and results are a lot easier to achieve if someone's given you an independent valuation. And it's not. I know it might feel like calling your baby ugly if you don't like the number, but it gives you a starting point. And it'll tell you, I see owners when they get a valuation, flip right to the number. They don't look at the 25 pages before the number and how that valuation was arrived.
No.
That number means something, but how you got that number is way more important.
Well, Rakesh, let's just be honest. Some babies are ugly. Yeah. if we're being honest, right?
Yeah.
Now, whether the parents ready to hear that or not.
So I think that our theme, that time to transition, time to understand what your business is all about and why it generates the value and how can you increase that value and build a legacy for yourself, if that's an important consideration. And I find generally for owners, their name is on the board. Their name is cars are driving by and their name is on the building. And so legacy is important.
Yeah. Yeah. And we haven't really touched on, the family aspects too, because that adds a whole other wrinkle into the equation for sure. But if we had to give everybody an idea in an ideal world where things are going to be able to accomplish whatever important goals that the owner had set out for themselves, what's the ideal timeline from, hey, listen, I need to position it other than the day you start your business. I need to get this organized for an orderly transition to accomplish whatever I feel is important in that transition. How much of a timeline would be kind of the ideal starting point?
Well, assuming that all your tax considerations, because there are three parties to every transaction, Colin:
Yeah.
buyer, seller, and Canada Revenue Agency.
There we go.
So,
Yes. Yeah, absolutely.
so let's assume that that the structure of the business is tax efficient,
Yeah.
because then you might need more than 2 years. But
Yeah.
generally, you could start the process. I would say start thinking about it 18 months in advance,
Mhm.
and you get your ducks in a row in terms of working with a professional to look at all of the steps. That would be, and I've seen transactions done in 6 months or even 3 months.
Oh, yeah, yeah. No, no, absolutely. I mean, you have the time you have. You can get it done probably in a very, very short period of time. But for an optimization or get to go through the steps, that'd be 18 months. You're probably building into that a due diligence process and financing process and things of that nature. That's what we've been that 18-month period. Is that what you're referring to?
Well, that's the outside, because let's say that it takes some time to get a valuation done of the business, because the owner needs to understand what they've got first, because he hasn't even
Yeah.
talked to the general manager. So have to do that homework. So I'm thinking 6 months minimum to 18 months.
Okay.
Because if the general manager doesn't have some of those characteristics or duties or so on, there may need to be some rethinking. I mean, that planning, when you hit the ground running, these deals can get done within 3 to 6 months. Now, we're doing a
Yeah.
management buyout right now, Colin, where everything was a go, financing is a go. They're doing an environmental phase two, it's called, and they've found something. Now, we've been waiting around for 2 months because it could get resolved, it may not get resolved. But Department of Environment, they work on their own timeline.
Yeah.
So if there's permits that are required for transfer of the business, there's other agencies, there's a landlord that needs notice, there's all kind, and banks generally can give you a term sheet within a week, but they would take 2 to 3 months to come up with a commitment letter and disperse the funds.
Yeah.
So a lot of these time frames are not in your control. So
Yeah. That's a really good point. I'd even back it up, saying I would probably suggest 5 years out, because for me, it's the trying to work with the general manager of that next group and give them an opportunity to take on some additional responsibility and go through that process. Now maybe you're already doing that. Maybe you're already in the process of bringing those people on. But if this is thoughts just occurring to you for the first time, and you're saying, I want my management team to be my succession plan, I hadn't thought about it before today,
yeah.
redesigning your structure and giving them the opportunities to start building up the skill set and prove to you that they are in a position to take it on. But again, these things evolve maybe a little more quickly sometimes, and you don't have that kind of foresight. But giving it enough time for that the management team to earn your trust and earn the skill set they're going to need to take this to the next level. Let me ask you a quick question, because the budget a couple of years ago had something, the EOTs, the employee ownership trust things, and I've never seen one in the wild. Is that something that has any merit, or you're seeing any use of anywhere out there, or is it?
I haven't seen one used, and we have 35 folks in our tax group.
Yeah.
So
Okay.
it exists, but I haven't run across one.
Yeah, I mean, in reading it and reading about it, I couldn't really come up with a scenario where I thought it would be an ideal fit, and I guess I'm wide open to hearing that at some point. And I think it's got a clock running on it. It's only currently available to 2026 anyway, so maybe it's something that was just it is not going to be a useful tool. So, big close. Anything that we haven't talked about? Is there anything you think people in this listening to this podcast still after all this time?
My feeling is that the first place an owner should look, you should start thinking about it early, but look at his or her their people, the people that they have, to see if they can transition that business to their management group. That's the first place I'd look. Often what happens is owners get a knock on the door, a buyer wants to buy the business, and off they go.
Yeah.
There's no auction, there's no process. They'll 5 months of negotiations, and they'll tell their accountants and lawyers, "Oh, I think I've got an offer." and they have no idea whether that was the best offer available. And basically, management is deer caught in the headlights. Now they're hearing rumors and so on. And and then guess what? A buyer says, "Oh, by the way, one of the conditions of closing is we need employment agreements from your three key employees based on our due diligence." Okay, well, good luck getting those employment agreements now after the fact. It's pretty hard for people to sign paper out of the blue. So I would
It's just,
recommend that
yeah.
you get those contracts in place well before any sale.
Yeah, well, I understand what the value of your business is. Again, that's another conversation I had with another business owner who did that, sold his business, and then went back to the office and told everybody this is what had happened. And when he was talking to me, his senior staff was all up in arms because they'd received their new employment contracts, and the new employment contracts all contained a 1 week clause. So some of them had been with them for 10, 15, 20 years, and they were being asked to sign a contract, basically allowing them to be let go with 1 week's notice. He goes, yeah, they're all upset about something. I got to go back and smooth that over. It's like, well, no, you're an idiot. And you should have seen that coming. And the fact you didn't makes you even a bigger idiot. But some of these things are just foreseeable. That's some good food for thought there. That timeline's important. The fact that there's money out there. Cash flow lending, you're right, is a new thing, a newer thing. And I think more of the major institutions are getting involved in it from my experience as well. It's not simple or easy, but cash flow lending is a thing. And it's probably more possible than some people are giving it credit for. Maybe if they go back and look around the office very carefully right now, they might see that, hey, there's enough talent here. And again, depending on where you feel your responsibility, maybe that's the group you should look to first.
Yeah, based on what I've heard today, Colin, you're in an excellent position to have those conversations with your clients and give them some food for thought. And that's all
Well,
it is just go back, take it away, and just think about it.
educate people and try to give them information they can use to make good decisions for themselves. That's what this is all about. So, Rakesh, thanks very much for sharing your time and your wisdom. And it's good to reconnect after all these years. And I'm glad I didn't piss you off too much as a prof, so that we can still have a civil conversation at this point in our life.
No, I believe in fate. I'm glad we met. Thank you, Colin. It was a
Have
pleasure.
have a good one.
You too. Bye bye.
Ever wondered why your financial advisor is recommending a specific investment? In an industry where conflicts of interest are everywhere, it is important to understand how the conflicts may impact you.
To find out more, contact us at Verecan. You can find us at annoyingthecompetition.com.
For more information on the subject of today's podcast or any other financial topic, please visit us online at verecan.com. That's Verecan.com. There's plenty of information there, or you can reach out to someone on the team. Thanks for listening. Please note, the information provided in this podcast is for general information purposes only. It is not intended as financial, investment, legal, tax, accounting, or other professional advice. Our discussions are not a solicitation to buy or sell any securities or to make any specific investments. Any decisions, based on information contained in this podcast, are the sole responsibility of the listener. We strongly advise consulting with a professional financial advisor before making any financial decisions. Listeners should be aware that investing involves risks and that past performance is not indicative of future results. Barenaked Money is produced by Verecan Capital Management, Inc., a licensed portfolio management company in Canada. We operate under the regulatory framework established by the provincial securities commissions in the provinces within which we operate. The views expressed in the podcast are our own and do not necessarily reflect the official policy or position of any regulatory authority. Remember, at Verecan Capital Management, Inc., we focus on aligning our goals with yours, prioritizing integrity and transparency. For more information about us and our services, please visit our website. Thank you for listening, and let's continue to challenge the norms of the financial services industry together.